So good afternoon, everyone. Sorry for the slight delay. We're only just getting used to having guests back in Roosevelt House, and we expect quite a few friends to be coming in and out during this spectacular sounding conference. And I'm Harold Holzer. I have the honor of serving as director of Roosevelt House, and on behalf of Jennifer Rabb, the president of Hunter College, I want to welcome you to the most timely event we've ever scheduled in the history of Roosevelt House. What better moment to discuss the New Deal and the New Deal than on the day that the President of the United States is directing the New Deal from the Vatican? I think that's a pretty interesting moment. And of course, we're also the perfect place to have these discussions. As I told our honored group, who we've come to call the descendants, which sounds glib, but it's meaningful because it's the descendants of Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt, whose home this was, and of the Brain Trust and the cabinet members who are gathered with us tonight, today and this afternoon. This was, of course, the home that Sarah Delano Roosevelt gave to FDR and Eleanor, at least half of it, as a combination wedding and Christmas present in 1905. It came with the caveat that Sarah was going to live on the west side of the house and the east side was reserved for Franklin and Eleanor. And then she famously moved the walls back in the dining room and opened the house. And as Eleanor unforgettably said, my mother-in-law was on my side of the house for the next 25 years, sometimes at the most unexpected moments, which we leave to our collective imagination. It's also the home where Franklin Roosevelt recovered from his bout with polio. It's the place where he managed his gubernatorial campaigns and his first campaign for the presidency. And in the second floor library upstairs, it is the place where the ancestors of our special guests gathered with FDR almost on a daily basis between Election Day 1932 and the date of the Roosevelt's departure for Washington around March 1st, 1933, to build the foundational blocks of the New Deal. So we're so honored to use Roosevelt House as a teaching institution for new generations of students, and so honored to have all of you here to discuss the New Deal and what it means in terms of history and how it might inspire and inspirit the future. When Tomlinson is here, I always say that his grandmother, Frances Perkins, entered this house with a set of demands in order to be considered for Secretary of Labor. It was nothing less than minimum wage, maximum hours, child labor laws, disability insurance, the forerunner of Medicare, and of course, old age pensions. All of that in one demand letter for a job interview, which I think is pretty extraordinary. And that happened upstairs on the second floor as well. So as I mentioned, we are honored today to welcome a distinguished group of descendants of Franklin Roosevelt and his cabinet members. They will get fuller introductions during the course of the day as they participate in panels. But just to mention them, Tomlin Perkins Coggeshall, who I mentioned a moment ago, David Hopkins Giffen, who is the great-grandson of Harry Hopkins, June Hopkins, the granddaughter and biographer of Harry Hopkins, James Roosevelt Jr., the grandson of Franklin and Eleanor, Phoebe Roosevelt, the great-granddaughter of FDR and ER, and the brain trust behind this gathering, Henry Scott Wallace, who is the grandson of Franklin Roosevelt, Secretary of Agriculture and Commerce, and of course, his vice president, Henry A. Wallace. Welcome to all of you. I can't let this moment go by where we're just going to be totally celebratory without acknowledging the fact that there is someone in the room whose grandfather was, shall we say, not a great supporter of the New Deal. So he's going to lead the loyal opposition, but I think he's sort of reformed. And that's Hamilton Fish, who is in the back. Welcome. Actually, I always tell him I met his grandfather in 1986 and this is the Roosevelt contemporary, the Martin Barton and Fish, Hamilton Fish, who, for some reason, but it was great, decided to endorse Bella Abzug when she ran for Congress in Westchester in a failed comeback bid in 1986. That was one of the best press conferences I've ever seen. I think I know he was in his 90s at the time, and he spoke for about 30 minutes in this endorsement. It was quite a show. Thank you all for your vision and dedication. Special welcome to my friend Jonathan Alter, who is the chronicler of several presidencies, not just the ones he covered as a journalist, but of course his writings on Franklin Roosevelt and his magisterial biography, most recently, of Jimmy Carter. It's great to have John in the house. John actually was in the house when it was locked down. He somehow managed to get in and film a television segment for which he assumed full medical liability. So we let him do it, and it seems to have worked. So this was a year of planning to get to this point. The long campaign to bring attention not only to the New Deal, but to how it should inspirit our current deliberations about the social safety net and the social contract. So we could not be more pleased and proud that all of your work led you here to Roosevelt House, and we look forward to a great conference. So just a note, I'm going to do the housekeeping thing and then just get off. I see you all understand that we need to be masked inside the building, even though you've all gone through the CUNY vaccine check, for which thanks. Our speakers, like our professors in the classes upstairs, do not have to be masked. They will be unmasked so you can see and hear them better. They've also been vetted for vaccination, I promise. Those of you who will join us virtually will note that we will take only 5-minute breaks between the sessions so we can pack all of our information and our comments into our 3 hours. And there will be an opportunity at the end of each session for audience questions. We will have a microphone, hand microphone brought around. You don't need to grab it. It will be held for you. That's another new COVID protocol. But other than that, you look prepared. I would like to hand it off now to the man, again, who has really shepherded us to this point and is moderating the first panel with John Alter and Nancy MacLean. Please welcome Henry Scott Wallace.
Thank you, Harold, and thank you to Jennifer Rabb and to the Roosevelt House for your hospitality. It's a fantastic partnership. Thank you for inviting us and making us feel so welcome. I want to ask Nancy and Jonathan to come on up and cue a very brief introductory video.
So, Doris, what changed for Joe Biden once he won, once he got in office?
I think what changed for him is the pandemic and the economic fallout and the fact that he was facing a crisis. It changed the country, it changed our view of leadership, and it changed Biden himself. You know, I think the reason why FDR gets talked about a lot is it's really the last time that the country felt this enormous fear and anxiety that we've lived with for the last year and hungered for leadership. And when he provided that leadership, he said, the government headlines said, the government still lives. You know, we have a leader. And it was a sense of responsibility on the government's part to the people that lasted until another transformational leader came along, Ronald Reagan, in 1981, at another joint session of Congress, his first speech, and he said government is the problem, not the solution. And a generation of conservatives followed, massive tax cuts, reduced federal spending. Now Biden's coming back. It's the kaleidoscope turns again to say it's time for government to not have the trickle-down theory, but instead to be responsible for the social being of the country.
But in many ways, the right wing in the country is still living in reaction to this redefinition of the relationship between the state and the individual that unfolded amid the crisis of the 1930s.
So we are now going to have a little discussion about that arc of history that was just very briefly described. Jonathan has been introduced in his brilliant book about the first 100 days of the Roosevelt administration, The Defining Moment. A brilliant book, I recommend it highly. And Nancy is the author of a brilliant book about the pushback against that, starting in the 50s, and the right-wing dismantling of what or the hoped-for dismantling. We'll see what happens in the next week or two. It's called Democracy in Chains, and a fantastic read as well. So we're going to start with Jonathan to talk about the New Deal, and then Nancy to follow, and then we'll have a little discussion about where that leaves us now. So Jonathan, take it away.
So I wanted to just quickly, thank you, Scott, and thank you, Harold. I wanted to just quickly kind of set the scene for what life in the United States was like on the eve of FDR taking office in 1933. In those days, the inauguration was in March. So the economy in the last quarter of 1932 dropped so precipitously that it set off a banking crisis, and banks started to close in Michigan and other parts of the country, and many were already closed when Roosevelt took office. The governor of New York closed the banks here on the night before the inauguration. So we were on a barter economy in a lot of places. And John Maynard Keynes in Great Britain was asked, have we ever seen anything like this before in human history? And he said, yes, it was called the Dark Ages, and it lasted for 400 years. People were depressed, not just economically, but emotionally and mentally. And there was a kind of there was not, trouble in the streets, although there were an awful lot of military who were put in place for the inauguration, more than at any time until this year for the inauguration. But people truly didn't know what was going to happen. And starting with his famous inaugural address, which was important not just for the great line about the only thing we have to fear is fear itself, but for other things he said. When you think about that line, if you're worried about putting food on the table or a roof over your head, that's not just fear itself. So that fear wasn't the only thing to fear. There were real things to fear for millions of Americans, but it was a kind of a suspension of disbelief, a conjuring act on Roosevelt's part. And actually the most important parts of the speech were when he said, we need action and action now. And and he used that word action 5 times in the speech. And so it was clear that he was going to start moving immediately. He was asked, the stakes were so high that he was asked, or told by a visitor. The identity of this person has never actually surfaced, so it could be an apocryphal story. Historians are a little suspicious when there's not a name attached, but a visitor said, Mr. President, if you succeed, you'll be our greatest president, and if you fail, you'll be our worst president. And Roosevelt said, no, if I fail, I'll be our last president. And the New York Daily News had a headline on an editorial, wanted a dictator. The Studebaker company made a car called the Dictator that was quite popular among people who still had any money in the early 30s. Mussolini was very popular, not just in Italy, but in the United States at that time. Hitler was just coming in the same month, so nobody knew much about him yet. So people wanted strong leadership, and when Joe Biden was asked about what struck him most in reading about the early Roosevelt presidency, his answer was the fragility of democracy. That was his takeaway from my book and others. And so he senses that not only, this isn't just about new programs that they're talking about this week that are an extension of the New Deal, but an ability to re-energize and even save democracy by showing that government can deliver for the people. So what was the New Deal? Actually, it was quite literally what it said. It was a new contract, a deal with the American people over what we owed each other. And all of the programs, all of the structural ideas on regulation and the jobs programs, they all came from a new conception of what we owed each other, coming out of the laissez-faire 1920s, as it was called, when it was every man for himself. And Roosevelt said, no, this idea of just sort of voluntary efforts, not enough. We need the government changing certain laws so that we can begin to connect with each other and lift each other up. And that's what happened. Now, to give you some hope, what Joe Biden is about to get through, and failure is not an option, so this will get done. It will add up to close to $5 trillion in public investment, which dwarfs anything that was done in the early New Deal. Now, it's a bigger country, but we are still on that same path. For those who are disappointed that certain things aren't in there, I would just urge you to read up on where Roosevelt fell short. He had huge Democratic majorities, but he didn't have Southern Democrats on a lot of things. They were racist Southern Democrats, so he had to compromise. So the Social Security Act of 1935 was actually not a very good piece of legislation. It excluded jobs that African Americans held because that was the only way that Roosevelt could get it through Congress, where many of the committees were chaired by Southern segregationists. But he knew that they could build on it in the years after that, and that he could come back to Congress for more, and that once there was kind of proof of principle established and you were filling out that new social contract, you could add new clauses. So I just mentioned that for people to take heart. So, okay, there's not a clean electricity plan, which was a very important part of Biden's program, but there are a lot of there's more than $500 billion in investments in clean energy. And there's a climate corps that's modeled on the Civilian Conservation Corps. It was one of the most important part of Roosevelt's first 100 days, and a series of other things that can be built on. Same is true the social welfare part of Biden's program. Once you get your foot in the door with major legislation, which is what's happening right now, you can build on it. And it's very important for those who believe in these ideas to not let the perfect be the enemy of the good and take yes for an answer and come back and fight another day. I'll just close by telling a story that many of you have probably heard about what happened shortly after Roosevelt's death in 1945. The motorcade with the flag-draped coffin was moving through Washington, and a man broke down in tears at the side of the road. And a reporter said, "Did you know the president?" And the man said, "No, but he knew me." And that sense of being able to walk in the shoes of the American people and connect to them, even though he came from a very different background than most people, was part of the Roosevelt magic. When he'd give a fireside chat, he would imagine a man painting a ceiling and another person at the cash register, and ordinary people listening at the other end to the fireside chats. And so part of effective leadership is making people believe that they have been seen and heard. And we will we will see as time goes on whether Joe Biden is capable of doing that. I believe that despite these temporary problems he's having in the polls, he's off to an historic start.
I guess I have the counterpoint role here. Start with a quote. "They should have been shot." That is what Charles Stuart Mott, a leader of the General Motors board and a philanthropist, told Studs Terkel when asked about the famed 1937 strikers, sit-down strikers who built the UAW. They had no right to sit down there, he explained to Terkel in 1970. The governor should have told them to move on or we'll shoot, and done it. Sure, he allowed, there would have been a certain number of people killed, but the lesson would have taken and stopped Franklin Delano Roosevelt, whom Mott called the Great Destroyer. All those years later, Mott still held to the property supremacist beliefs of the American Liberty League that the chairman of General Motors, Albert Sloan, had joined with the three DuPont brothers and leading bankers to launch in 1934. Why? Irene DuPont minced no words. He said, "The so-called New Deal is nothing more or less than the socialist doctrine called by another name." The Socialist Party leader, Norman Thomas, objected that it was not, but to no avail. DuPont envisioned the group as a property owners association to preserve economic liberty, with the America since the late 19th century Gilded Age as a model. League members held to the now embattled elite creed. Inviolable property rights were the basis of liberty. Government had no right to interfere with business, let alone enable workers to organize. After all, poverty was inevitable, caused by laziness or immorality. Voluntary, private charity for the deserving poor was the only proper help. As for those like the Flint sit-down strikers, they deserved what they would get. Sorry, I thought I was going to be at a podium, but this was going to be a little more subtle. No, it's cool, as long as you bear with me. So League members viewed Roosevelt's policies as violations of their rights and infringements on their liberty, rights and liberties that they believed were enshrined in the U.S. Constitution as originally written. Stunned at losing unilateral control of their enterprises, they set out to win it back. They worked mainly with Republicans at first, and after 1937, with conservative Southern Democrats. The League drew some of the wealthiest and most powerful men in America. It had the editorial backing of much of the press and the radio. It had more funding than a political party, all of which made it the leading opposition to Roosevelt. Yet ultimately, it failed, and miserably, by 1936, for reasons that have a lot to tell us about what we face today. Because today, we face a radical right that has studied and learned from past failures to achieve a power that no one outside its own ranks would have predicted in 2008. I could not agree more wholeheartedly with Jonathan Alter's vision of the New Deal's achievements and with that of the conference organizers about what America needs in our pivotal moment for the economy, for the well-being of the people, life on our planet, and to save democracy from the forces now menacing it. But to achieve that vision in the face of existential threats, I believe it is absolutely vital to take full measure of the opposition. And here is a troubling truth. Progressive Americans have never come to terms fully with the relentless determination of the capitalist radical right. Not all capitalists, I want to make very clear, but the most arch and ideological, those like Charles Stuart Mott, Albert Sloan, and the DuPonts in FDR's day, and like Charles Koch and the network of like-minded donors he has built up in our own time. These men feel a deep sense of legitimacy in their quest to overpower robust multiracial democracy. As a historian of the American right, I can tell you that this lineage goes back, goes way back. In fact, goes all the way back to the most unyielding figures at the first Constitutional Convention in 1787, the slaveholding delegates from South Carolina and Georgia. Among the richest men of their time, they insisted on putting the most property-encasing anti-democratic articles into the Constitution as the price of their staying to sign on to it. That lineage then moves on through the leaders of the militant South who seceded from the Union. It reemerged with the destruction of Reconstruction when the reunion of Northern and Southern elites created the free-range capitalism that the American Liberty League and the Charles Koch Network look back to as a model. After the League closed its doors in 1940, the tradition went dormant, but only for a short time, reemerging in the post-war Red Scare, the John Birch Society, the radicalization of the Republican Party by the 1964 Barry Goldwater campaign, the 1971 Powell Memorandum calling for a corporate mobilization to restore the power and authority of what he called free enterprise, then the victory of Ronald Reagan and the Gingrich Republicans. In our time, we see this tradition at work in the pincers operation created by the Koch donor network and a GOP voter base radicalized by Fox News and Donald Trump. What united this tradition over time was an ideology that I have come to think about as property supremacy. Its callousness toward the people, I think, is well captured in that quote I began with from Charles Stewart Mott. While it is hard for most of us to imagine some of the richest men seeing themselves as victims exploited by their fellow citizens, in order to grasp why they are trying to permanently rig the rules of our society today, we must. So let me turn then, as I start wrapping up, to the fate of the American Liberty League. Again, remember, this league included some of the wealthiest, most powerful men of the age. How did it lose? In a word, politics. Politics in a particular context. FDR was a master player at turning the tables on these men, and they were clueless, absolutely clueless, about how to win over voters. One Texas businessman quipped about the Liberty League's disastrous opposition to Roosevelt in 1936, and I quote, "The capitalist system can be destroyed more effectively by having men of means defend it than by importing 1 million Reds from Moscow to attack it." But now, fast forward. Like the Obama administration before it, the Biden administration came into office with a tremendously popular agenda and more voters behind it than ever before. Yet, both ran into unyielding opposition that almost immediately trimmed their sails. Why the difference in efficacy with FDR? Many reasons we can discuss this afternoon, but the crucial one I want to point to is the difference between the American Liberty League and the Koch network. Although they share that same ideology of extreme economic liberty at odds with what most of the people want and with the well-being of the people and the planet, in our case, today's arch capitalist right has learned from past failures, and that's really what I want to end with here. After having studied and learned from the previous losses, the Koch network has built a determined, unbelievably well-funded powerhouse to defeat the Biden agenda and the popular hopes it represents. The Koch folk, though, are far more strategic than their forebears. Instead of putting rich men on the front lines, the ultra-wealthy fund literally hundreds of organizations that can appear independent of them. They fund scholars and PR firms and pollsters and think tanks to gussy up Liberty League tenants and make them sound forward-looking. And unlike the League, they have built alliances with popular forces. They have reached out and aligned with groups that have large numbers of motivated voters, above all the religious right and gun owners. And sadly, this donor-built right is employing a more cohesive, integrated, and message-disciplined strategy than Democrats have in play, and one with a clear endgame. That endgame is radical rules change to enable a tiny ideological minority to dominate a vast majority that is yearning to meet the challenges of the 21st century, but is stymied by all of what I have just described. And we can go into the details of that rule rigging, but I think you can pretty quickly conjure them up. So before, though, I leave you all terrified and discouraged after Jonathan's wonderful presentation, let me add something else as a historian and a historian who has studied and teaches about social movements. That is, never before in our history, through all the times that the property supremacists almost prevailed, Never before in our history has the progressive side had greater and more wide-ranging resources. Certainly, the progressive side did not have those resources or anything like them in the 1860s or in the 1930s or in the 1960s. Our potential today could be truly unbeatable if we were aligned and determined as the other side is. But, and this is a very big but, if we fail to recognize that those blocking progress believe deeply that they are in a war for their country, and if we fail to see that they are much more strategically marshaling their resources to win that war, then we could lose everything. We still have time, but not much. Thank you.
That's great, Nancy. Thank you. That illuminates a lot. And you touched on the differences between where FDR found himself and where Biden finds himself. I'm sure you know the Rauchway book now, Why the New Deal Matters. There was a professor, Jeffrey Isaac, who explained in a review of that 3 reasons, huge reasons, that today is harder for Biden than it was for FDR. One is that labor is weaker now than it was then. They were a huge ally of FDR. One is the racialization of our politics, the George Floyd murder, and this critical race theory stuff that is being exploited by the right and promoting division. And the other is the sort of civil war among the Republican Party with the conspiracy theorists promoting division and discord and toxicity in our politics. And then you, of course, have talked about in your book how the right has learned that they can't win a majority vote through regular voting. They have to rig the vote. They have to get fewer of them, of us to vote, and more of them. So you got to rig the game. You got to change the rules. So would you each talk about whether fundamentally you think Biden, you've given some cause for optimism that Biden can be FDR if the progressive movement can organize, and we do have a great deal of resources. But if you would both comment on whether this can be a New Deal moment despite these headwinds and Fox News and everything else.
He's not going to be an FDR, because FDR, first of all, he was in office for 12 years, and he had overwhelming Democratic majorities. And it's quite possible that the Democrats will lose the House next year. So it may be that this moment that we're in right now is what a lot of what we're going to get. Now, there's been some, I think, misunderstanding of what early next year could bring. The rules have just been clarified by the parliamentarian that you can go and use reconciliation, the budget reconciliation process, more than once a fiscal year now. So at the beginning of next year, the Democrats can come at some of these things that they fell short on, but they have to convince Manchin and Sinema. So, just to give you an example, in the 1932 election, the Democrats won 97 seats, new seats. They had huge, and this is something that Rauchway didn't, to me, that the most important difference are the margins. Yeah. And they won 12 seats in the Senate that year. So, yes, Roosevelt had a divided Democratic Party between northern liberals and southern racist conservatives, and he had to do a lot of tap dancing to keep his party united, and maybe didn't do as well on civil rights as Eleanor and clearly us would have wanted him to in a perfect world. But he was able to get a huge amount of his program through. Not everything. In 1937, he tried to expand the Supreme Court, which people are suggesting that, including me, that Biden should do, and it didn't work. So even Roosevelt could not get everything he wanted. But I think whatever one thinks of Joe Manchin, he had a good line when he was asked, why should he have the power to take out these progressive things that he's deleting. The billionaire's tax is the one that is ticking me off the most today. But and he said, well, elect more Democrats. It's not that complicated. Like, people have to stop wringing their hands and start ringing doorbells. And then maybe something can change.
That's a great line. I'm going to have to plagiarize, and we're all going to have to use. So I would just add a few more structural things to that, because I think some accounts now of what the difference is do go astray. And it just, speaking as a historian, I mean, one thing I'd say is that the parties used to be crazy quilts. It's hard for me to tell students this, but there used to be liberal Republicans, right, in places like New York. And there were totally reactionary Democrats. But it was in that crazy quilt system Roosevelt was able to prevail. Now it's one of those be careful what you wish for things, as people were talking about in the 1940s and 50s on the progressive side, wanting to have an ideological sorting of the parties. It came too late after labor was weakened and many other things had happened. But now we have a Republican Party, there's political scientists who talk about this as, I don't know, they have some clunky term, but basically it's the Republicans who have polarized, right? I mean, they're off the charts in aggression and discipline, in, norm breaking, and in the agenda that they're carrying. So that makes for a very different lineup, particularly if you have the kind of small margins that Scott is talking about. But the other thing, I think, is another thing that's really an important piece of that. In the 1930s, the South was, as Roosevelt said, the nation's #1 economic problem, right? These Southern reactionary senators and House members, at least in the early New Deal, before labor became stronger, thought, we need this thing. Our region has been sick for a decade now. All our industries are sick: agriculture, coal, et cetera, tobacco. So they wanted that federal action. They wanted that intervention in the South. Now the South is pretty wealthy, and it's all Republican. So it's a very, very different kind of national map. I think there's other things, too, the international situation. Roosevelt was, imminently conscious, as were many in Congress, that they had fascism on the right and communism on the left, and that they were trying to show to the people that liberal democracy could deliver, right? That it could really work for the people. Did that magnificently, but we don't have that situation either now. And the last thing I'll say, when Roosevelt was putting through the New Deal, we talked about Francis Perkins earlier today, who was a person of deep faith. There was almost a religious phalanx defending the New Deal, right? Catholics, Jews, mainline Protestants who still had huge congregations. We're in a different world now with the faith map in this country. So that's another feature, I think, of the difference. So I think there have been deep economic, political, structural, and cultural changes that we need to be mindful of. But then I think it goes to being politically savvy and strategic enough to be able to navigate that new world.
Jonathan, let me just interject briefly. There will be a time for Q&A. So we're taking questions over Zoom and in the room. So think about that as Jonathan
I was just going to say very
responds.
briefly, I completely agree with you that there's a kind of a toughness gap here between the parties, and Roosevelt, was arguably much tougher as a politician, and that Democrats nowadays need to grow a pair, I think, if they're going to compete in this environment that you described. And there's a certain kind of almost unilateral disarmament. That's not to say that they should engage in the lies and politics of personal destruction that the Republicans use, but they need to get tougher. Yeah. And especially in mobilizing resentment. So it looks like Terry McAuliffe will probably lose in Virginia. The latest polls are not good. I mean, he could prove me wrong, but they somehow, when they get in the scrum, that's a Democratic state now, they're missing something about how to connect with voters and where they really live.
Just to second that point, one of the wonderful people that I've gotten to know since Democracy in Chains came out is retired Army Colonel Lawrence Wilkerson, who was Colin Powell's assistant aide, and he, when Colin Powell was Secretary of State, and I asked Larry why, because now he's quite a critic of U.S. foreign policy and much of what's going on in the country, and what turned him was Colin Powell being forced to lie by the Bush administration about the weapons of mass destruction and then the torture. But anyway, he's an extraordinary voice now for defending democracy, and he was part of two of the national coalitions, the Task Force on National Election Integrity and the Protect Democracy Group. Anyway, one of those in the run-up to the 2020 election had wargaming exercises, and as a military person, you know, he could participate in this. And I'm not saying anything out of school. They actually told the press this. But when the Democrats showed up for these wargaming exercises, they were so complacent and blasé that the other people had to say, hey, if you're not going to get serious and understand that the other side is thinking of this as a war and they want to take you out, there's no point in us doing this exercise. So just to underscore your point that I think there's, you know, very strategic calculation going on one side that is playing quite advanced chess while we're treating everything as kind of a normal election when we're not in normal times anymore and we're not facing a normal opposition.
Well, I hope January 6th demonstrated the reality of the war clearly to everybody. Any questions in the room? A microphone? Front row here.
Okay. Thanks. I wonder if you could each say a little bit about the role of the media in the New Deal versus the role of the media today. Frankly, I only know a little bit I know there was sensationalist media. I know there was mainstream media then, and so on. But there obviously was not cable TV and so on. Today, we have the fragmentation of media, the constant presence of media. But even the mainstream media we have that likes to characterize, for example, what's been going on in Congress over the last 2 months as infighting, not compromise and negotiation, but make it sound like trivial politics. Can you talk about how the media has influenced where we were then versus where we are now?
I'm so glad that you raised that point. This is Jim Roosevelt, and I'm so honored to be in the presence of so many descendants of the Roosevelts and the Roosevelt Brain Trust and High Command. So, yeah, I threw down my New York Times when I saw they had a lead a few weeks ago about Democrats feuding. Democrats aren't feuding, they're legislating. Like, they're so out of the habit of covering real legislation because we've had so little of it in the last few years. Trump just had like 2 or 3 major pieces of legislation total that they don't get that this process that we're seeing up close right now is actually pretty normal. But in answer to your basic question, in the 1930s, the reporters were pro-New Deal, and the owners were anti-New Deal. So the editorials would be against Roosevelt, but the news coverage would be, sometimes slanted in his favor and certainly buying into his agenda. So just to give you one, I think, relevant example, from the time at the 1932 convention when he coined the phrase New Deal, we need a New Deal for America, the press immediately picked up on it, and his entire program was in that frame. Compare that to Build Back Better, which Biden introduced last year. Now you could argue, well, Biden's not as good a communicator as Roosevelt. I'll stipulate that. But also, the press won't call it his Build Back Better program, because I don't know if they think that's like carrying water for him to call his program what he calls it. And we saw that some under Obama as well. So this fragmentation that you're talking about has led to the introduction of flat-out lies into our political discourse. So we have, a third of the country that believes that Biden isn't a legitimate president, which is a terrible, terrible thing for us. And I would argue that actually our democracy is under more threat today than it was in the early 1930s. I didn't really think we were ripe for revolution in that period, and we weren't going to have fascism either. And now I think we're more in danger, as Scott said. Elections rigged, and the Republicans are in a position where they're basically saying, heads we win, tails you lose. We'll litigate every election that we lose. And I think they will probably for many, many years to come. And the reason they can get away with this is because they have a network that has now really shaded over into promoting lies. They're about to say that January 6th was a false flag and, you know, just try to turn it into an Orwellian moment where they just completely deny what everybody saw with their own eyes. So I'm seriously alarmed about where we are right now, and I think it's really for the reasons that you put your finger on.
And I would just add to that, and I'll be brief because I know questions are starting to come up from the audience, but the kind of folks that I was talking about were crucial in ending the fairness doctrine in media, right, in broadcasting. And so that opened the airwaves to the Rush Limbaughs, the Mark Levins, you know, all of these people, and to Fox News. And so I think that's part of the mix. And also the falling out of the financial bottom of so much journalism, investigative journalism, particularly at the state level. So we don't have people really reporting on what's going on in states like North Carolina. There aren't people on that State House beat in the way that they used to be. And of course, there's Fox News, the elephant in the room, which media scholars have shown us doesn't actually provide news and adequate information. It's a 24/7 identity cultivating and agitating mechanism to produce in its viewers this sense of this embattled white, particularly evangelical identity. And when people are in that stress state of thinking everyone is attacking them, they're not especially rational. So they're very vulnerable to these kinds of challenges. But there are some really great, if anybody's interested in talking more about this, there's a great book called The Disinformation Age that a number of specialists in communications and media were part of. So that would answer some more questions.
FDR didn't have to worry about social media.
Yeah,
Huge
exactly.
thing.
Yeah.
We packed a very tight agenda. I'm very sorry for it, but we have one question from Zoom. Mac is monitoring questions on Zoom.
We're going to answer much more briefly, right?
Okay.
Yeah.
So there are more than 180 people joining us today on Zoom, and I'm going to ask a question from one of those virtual participants. Lori Tisch, a great friend to Hunter College and to Roosevelt House. She asks, do you think it's possible for some type of paid leave to come back, perhaps with a minimum of 4 weeks?
So I tweeted this morning that I thought it was, and people were laughing at me on Twitter saying I was naive. But just to quickly say why I think it's quite possible. There is some support among some Republican senators for family leave because it's so popular with the public. Now, they can't vote for this bill because this huge bill, it's a party line matter. But even on the infrastructure bill, they got a bipartisan coalition together for that, and they got, I think, what was it, 19 Republicans. So it's very possible that early next year, after everybody's kind of recovered from this and they come back and start legislating again, that they will introduce under reconciliation family leave as a standalone bill. And I think I'm not saying it's a sure thing, but I think it's quite possible that even if they get nothing in this bill in the next few days, they'll come back for more. And we haven't even talked about if they move to a talking filibuster, which is quite possible. Senator Durbin told me recently he thought there was a reckoning coming on the filibuster. People have seen it as a binary thing, like keep it or eliminate it. It's not binary. There are these reform ideas. It's probably not going to be a carve-out because Manchin's against that, but he's open to the idea of a talking filibuster. And if that goes through, then you could get immigration reform, you could get reproductive rights legislation that would do something about this horrendous Texas law, and possibly even a gun safety measure, and maybe some other things, and force those guys to have 41 members on the floor at all times. A lot of them are old. They can't stay up all night, night after night after night with these filibusters. And, you know, you could have a Jimmy Stewart, return to the Jimmy Stewart filibuster and actually get some things through. Now, people might say that's Pollyannish, but I think it's possible.
With apologies, we're going to have to wrap up. You did
I'm sorry, I didn't
raise
answer
the question of the filibuster. We have the world's leading expert on the filibuster on the next panel, Adam Gentleson.
Sorry.
So we will learn more about that as a pivotal part of the sausage-making process here.
The impact of President Biden's infrastructure and reconciliation plans have drawn comparison to FDR's New Deal.
How do you compare in that way, legislatively, what Joe Biden has done so far, what he hopes to do in the next few weeks compared to FDR?
Well, this is what they call a transforming president, meaning a president who's not just trying to fix problems he's dealing with, but also change the system so that those problems are less likely to happen again. And that's why we honor FDR.
Because of the New Deal, the government had assumed greater responsibility for the well-being of its citizens. Citizens are no longer on their own in times of crisis. The government is more active in creating jobs when firms simply can't. People can trust that the government can act when the economy fails.
FDR in 1932, promising a beleaguered country a new deal.
With these lofty and expensive progressive plans, can Joe Biden really be the next FDR?
FDR would come back to Warm Springs often to think about how to heal the nation and the world. And that's exactly what he did, lifting us out of a Great Depression, defeating tyranny, saving democracy.
Is it fair to compare Biden to FDR?
Senator Cory Booker called the Biden plan historic, comparing it to Eisenhower and FDR in its size and impact.
His recovery plans, the most ambitious seen since the New Deal of the 1930s, redefined the role of government in the United States.
It would make Biden the most progressive president since Franklin Delano Roosevelt.
Joe Biden has issued more executive orders, more substantive proclamations than any president since FDR by a margin.
What would Franklin Roosevelt say?
FDR, brilliant line. He said, above all, try something. Try a method. If it fails, admit it frankly and try another. But above all, try something.
It's big, yes. It's bold, yes. And we can get it done.
Biden's gonna be FDR, we promise.
Like a 21st century FDR.
Biden's New Deal.
The New Deal.
A New Deal?
A 21st century New Deal.
Joe Biden's being touted as the new Roosevelt.
FDR got this right, Biden can too.
I got a portrait of Roosevelt in my office, okay?
So we have a brilliant panel to discuss what is at stake today in 4 key areas. We're going to start with jobs. David Raymer, who's written a fantastic book about New Deal 3.0 called The Case for, Putting Government in Its Place, The Case for a New Deal 3.0. And he will talk about the resonance of today's infrastructure and jobs plans under Biden and in comparison to the New Deal. Mary Ellen Sprinkle is president and CEO of the CORE Network, a nationwide network of Job Corps organizations, and a Hill staffer for some 10 years, so she knows the sausage-making machine as well. Then Michael Waldman, my good friend from the Brennan Center, on whose board I am privileged to sit, who has written the book on the right to vote, which he calls The Fight to Vote, and numerous other books, such as about the Second Amendment, a biography. And finally, addressing the obstacle to anything and everything happening through anything other than reconciliation, we have America's leading expert on the filibuster, Adam Gentleson, who has written a fantastic book on What to Do About It, called Kill Switch. All these books, by the way, are available through the Hunter College bookstore called Shakespeare and Company. So let me start with David on jobs.
Thank you. Our topic is what are the great needs of the country at this time? And I want to launch into that by saying that in addition to, as Jonathan Alter mentioned, the need in 1933 was action and action now, with action being repeated. What also was repeated a lot in that inaugural address was the need for work. Roosevelt talked about a great army of citizens toiling, of unemployed citizens. He talked about toil. He talked about our single greatest challenge was to put people back to work. Work was mentioned a lot. Not a safety net, not welfare, not relief, but work. So I'm going to talk about work, make 3 points about where we are today in dealing with the need for work. The first point I want to make is that, and this may come as a surprise to some people, but during the Great Depression, it was clear that the U.S. had far more unemployed people looking for work than jobs available. What the surprise is that if you look at the U.S. labor market today, over the last 2 decades of this century, for the most part, there are more people at any one time who want a job than there are jobs available, more unemployed people than job openings. Sometimes, as during the Great Recession, a couple of decade or so ago, as well as last year, the job shortage was enormous. And occasionally, there are times when it disappears or seems to disappear using a conservative definition of unemployment. But usually that's temporary. And I think what we're seeing now is a temporary equalization of the officially unemployed, at least, and the number of job openings. But when you look at the data for most of the years and most of the months, using all of the measures of unemployment that the BLS comes out with, there are many more people who want a job than there are jobs listed. Typically, it's 2 to 1, 2 unemployed people using the official conservative definition compared to jobs of any description. So we have a job shortage. It's the norm. Sometimes it shrinks and even vanishes, but by and large, it's there. Policy should be based on the fact that it's there most of the time, and I think we'll be resetting back to a job shortage within a few months. So it's commendable that the Biden administration and Congress have taken it upon themselves in the reconciliation bill to try to create more jobs. My estimate is that there's between $16 and $19 billion allocated in 3 different pots to create more jobs. One pot that we'll hear more about involves the Civilian Climate Corps. I add up about $8 billion split between the Department of Agriculture and Interior to create Civilian Climate Corps jobs to deal with climate change and its sort of associated efforts to preserve the environment. There's also about $4 billion split between AmeriCorps and the Department of Labor, and another $6 to $9 billion, depending on the formula, in other Labor Department programs. We don't know how much of this will survive. It looks like the Civilian Climate Corps will, hopefully with a very large amount of money. So we do have very worthy, very large subsidized jobs programs in the reconciliation bill, which we can all hope will become law. And they will shrink the job shortage, but we need to go a lot further. So there are a couple things that I think are needed in order to deal with the remaining large job shortage that will still be there even after these programs are put in place. The first thing that we need to do is to be sure that the reconciliation bill's subsidized jobs programs are well run, that they're coordinated in the legislation. They're scattered among different agencies. It's hard to find them, but they need to be coordinated. They need to be obviously operated with integrity and efficiency, as were the New Deal jobs programs, and they need to hire as many people as possible. It's also important, and this goes back to what was said in the prior panel, they need to be visible. People need to see that unemployed people were put to work. They need to see the workers. They need to see the projects. They can't just happen but be unknown. But there's a larger point that I want to make. The missing piece in all this is that it's important to create a big, permanent program whose primary purpose is to create the jobs themselves. Jobs are sort of a byproduct of some of the other initiatives that I've talked about. They're important, but they're of secondary importance. The CWA and the WPA, however, made jobs the primary goal. And then what they did with that work was important, but in a sense secondary. So we need to have a program that's large, fluctuating, getting larger when things get bad and smaller when things get better. We need to be sure it's very visible. We need to be sure it doesn't end after a certain period of time, because the crisis of a lack of jobs isn't going to go away anytime soon. And we need to have a program whose primary focus is to make sure that anyone who needs 40 hours of paid work can easily get it. That, together with other things needed in the labor market, higher minimum wage, paid leave, a bigger earning supplement, child tax credit, and so forth, stronger collective bargaining, all are part of what's needed to get back to what FDR said in March of 1933, tackling jobs as the most important thing the government needs to do.
Thank you, David.
I'm Mary Ellen Sprinkle. I'm the president and CEO of the Corps Network, which is the National Association of Service and Conservation Corps. And I thank you very much for the opportunity to join this very distinguished panel. As this group knows, probably better than most, nearly a century ago, this country faced some significant challenges, including the Great Depression, widespread poverty and unemployment, and severe economic degradation caused by over-farming, over-logging, and that caused mass erosion, floods, and wildfires across the country. At that time, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt worked with some of your ancestors to put 3 million young men to work, planting trees, restoring habitat, fighting fires, building a state park system, and a national infrastructure that we still use today. It also laid the groundwork for a very well-trained workforce and for one of the most strongest periods of economic growth in the country. And now, 30 or 90 years later, we are somewhat in a similar situation. Exacerbated by the global pandemic, youth unemployment is extremely high, twice that the national average, with numbers even higher for young people of color. In addition, we face dire consequences of climate change caused by decades of industrialization, pollution, irresponsible use of our natural resources. Temperatures are rising, sea levels rising, ice caps are melting, and we are subject to an increasingly frequent and severe natural disasters and storms. And so what we had referred to, I think as 100 or 500-year storms, now happen every few years. Hurricanes, floods, and tornadoes regularly rip through the same communities. And the wildfire season is about pretty much year-long at this point. 9 of the 20 largest wildfires in Colorado history happened in the last 3 years, and 2020 was the worst year, the worst single year for wildfire in California, burning over 4 million acres. These disasters and storms, they cost millions of dollars or billions of dollars and lives, and unless we do something to address the root causes of climate change and help communities become more resilient to storms and disasters, it's only going to get worse. So today, we once again have an opportunity to take a bold action that has the potential to slow the pace of climate change, make communities across the country more resilient to and prepared for extreme weather and natural disaster, to develop the next generation of workers for a clean and sustainable economy, and in such a way that is equitable and inclusive and specifically benefits those populations and communities that have been left behind. During his first week in office, President Biden issued an executive order calling for the establishment of a new CCC, a Civilian Climate Corps, to specifically mobilize the next generation of conservation and resilience workers to maximize the creation of accessible training opportunities and good jobs, to conserve and restore public lands and waters, bolster community resilience, increase reforestation, increase carbon sequestration, protect biodiversity, and improve access to recreation and address climate change. And over the last 9 months, there have been more than a dozen pieces of legislation introduced in Congress to fund and establish that, varying in size and scope. We have seen champions in Raul Grijalva from Arizona, Jonah Goose from Colorado, Chris Coons from Delaware, Ed Markey, Massachusetts, and Secretary Schumer Majority Leader Schumer has embraced the idea of a climate change or a climate conservation corps. So because of this widespread support, I'm pleased to say that as we sit here today, legislation and the budget reconciliation package in particular includes billions of dollars for a new CCC, and it moves closer to passage and to the president's desk, hopefully. The legislation, which we saw for the first time last night, includes significant investments in AmeriCorps and several Department of Labor programs, including Youth Build and Job Corps, to engage more than 300,000 civilian climate corps members over the next 10 years. It requires that corps members be paid a livable wage and have the potential to earn scholarship funding for additional education and training. The legislation also includes significant funding for the Departments of Interior, Agriculture, and Commerce for CCC projects to meet the goals that I just described above. Unlike the CCC of the 1930s, we don't have to start from scratch. There, as many of you probably know, the idea of a civilian conservation corps really never went away. The Student Conservation Association in the 1960s started recruiting young people to help with the capacity in the National Park Service. In the 1970s, Governor Jerry Brown started the California Conservation Corps. Those programs, and actually many, many others, are still operating in communities across the country today. The Corps Network, which is my organization, currently represents 140 programs across the country. Unlike the original CCC, which was entirely government-run and led, today's corps are primarily community-based, nonprofits. Some are housed in post-secondary institutions and entities of state and local government. They engage between 20 and 25,000 corps members a year. And also, unlike the CCC of the 1930s, they are very diverse and inclusive. About 45% of corps members identify as female, and nearly 50% identify as people of color. In addition, today's corps members span the socioeconomic and education level spectrum. So a corps member might be returning from the juvenile justice system, or he or she might be working on a master's or exploring a career in land management. So a very diverse group of young people. Likewise, the projects that corps engage are very diverse. The Montana Conservation Corps, which was in an article I think that was included in our material, they might be building trails and fighting wildfire, where Green City Forest here in Brooklyn is retrofitting and weatherizing low-income and public housing and community gardens. So diverse work as well. Last year alone, corps members planted over 1 million trees, cleared more than 32,000 acres of invasive species and hazardous fuel, restored over 1.7 million acres of habitat, and more than 7,300 miles of waterway, and improved the energy efficiency of over 7,000 homes. So corps are doing and have been doing great work for decades. What this new investment will enable more than 300,000 corps members to serve across the country, and some will have opportunities to go across the country like the original CCC. Others will have an opportunity to stay in their own communities. It will slow the pace of climate change, build a skilled and equitable workforce, and provide economic opportunity to all. And like the original CCC, it will provide young Americans with an opportunity to interact with people from different backgrounds and experiences, to bridge the divides that we heard about during our last panel, and to continue to contribute to something larger than themselves. And as FDR said in the 1930s, more important than the material gains of the CCC will be the moral and spiritual value of the work. And it worked nearly a century ago, and we believe it can work again today.
Thank you, Mary Ellen. Good. It's very encouraging, and it's so great to see the original CCC as the inspiration of it. I'd also note Today's New York Times reports that the new package, the reconciliation package, has a total of $560 billion for climate. So way beyond the CCC, we're going to have tax incentives for charging 500,000 electric vehicle charging stations, jobs created because of that massive investment in climate, hopefully, out of the new reconciliation bill. Now let's turn to a problem that is not going to be solved anytime soon, the challenges to democracy. Michael.
Thank you, Scott, and thank you for having me and for your work with the Brennan Center and the Wallace Global Fund and everything you do. I believe we are in a great struggle for the future of constitutional democracy in this country. The stakes are that great, it's nothing less. And in many ways, the issue and the challenges are different from those faced by or addressed by FDR in the New Deal. They go much more directly to the structures of our democratic system and go much more directly to many of the racial divisions that were elided as part of the New Deal during that period. Now, we all know that voting rights and some of those kinds of political reforms were not central to the New Deal. Were not central to the extraordinary administration of President Roosevelt. It is the case that he did take on the poll tax, that the attempted purge of conservative senators in 1938 revolved around that to a significant degree, unsuccessfully, that the first national voting rights legislation in well over half a century was passed as part of the Soldier Voting Act, which ended the poll tax for soldiers overseas of both races, with Eleanor Roosevelt's extraordinary leadership. And in an interesting way, he did oversee, and the political coalition led to a significant change in democratization in campaign finance during the New Deal period, with the rise of political action committees as the way for labor to get on an even playing field for a little while, at least, with wealthy people and big business. But and it is also true that to the extent the Great Society was the successor, and LBJ certainly saw it that way, and the Voting Rights Act was one of the crowning achievements of the Great Society. That too was a product of the forces set in motion by the New Deal. But as I said today, for many different reasons, we face a crisis in American democracy. Some of it certainly has to do with the changes in the country, massive demographic change, a backlash to that demographic change of a kind we've seen other times in American history, but increasingly hardening into a politics of white national identity and white resentment. A political system drenched in dark money, overwhelmed by big money, and in its, oh, thank you, sorry. Overwhelmed, but that's the way, that's a hint to stay within your time when the moderator hands you a watch. Drenched in dark money and big money. And we're all very familiar with these things. And so many of these things came to a point in 2020, which in my view will be looked at as a rather extraordinary year, going into 2020 for so many reasons, but including around the issue of democracy. For so many, we knew going into 2020 that there would be a huge turnout and that the system wasn't really ready for it. But then along came the pandemic in March of 2020, and it looked for a while like we might not have in our country free and fair elections, like the pandemic would simply make it impossible. And there was a mobilization. There was $400 million from Congress. States, state election officials, business, labor, voting rights groups mobilized to make it so that we could have a real election, and so that on election day, despite the pandemic, and despite the voter suppression, and despite the lies, it was the highest voter turnout since 1900. As the federal government said, it was the most secure election in history, something we ought to celebrate. Now, what happened? We all know what happened. Trump's big lie that the election was stolen, the insurrection driven by that big lie, and now, in 2021, state legislatures embracing that big lie, passing the most significant wave of of new voting laws to restrict the vote or change the rules of who counts the votes since the Jim Crow era. It's in many ways the great political clash of this time. These states are rushing forward to do this. Congress has the power to stop it cold, legally, constitutionally. The only question is, does it have the political will to stop it? That's the question we're facing right now. There is no solution to this other than federal legislation. And here I'm maybe a little more Pollyanna-ish or a little more hopeful than you might think. The bill now known as the Freedom to Vote Act, authored in significant measures by Senator Joe Manchin of West Virginia, is different from the legislation that was originally introduced, but would be the most significant democracy reform legislation in over half a century by far. Its companion bill has passed the House of Representatives. A majority of the Senate now supports it. The only question, Adam will tell us about this, is whether we can get it through the Senate, but I have reason to think that momentum is strong. The John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act will be brought to a vote in coming days. That also has passed the House. That also would strengthen and renew the Voting Rights Act, which was gutted by the Supreme Court. It also has the support of a majority of the Senate. These are really significant matters. It's a significant thing as well that the Democratic Party, for the first time, has focused on democracy reform as a central political goal for the party in a way it has not in a long, long, long time. Speaker Pelosi has been an extraordinary champion of this. Senator Schumer has been an extraordinary champion of this. I'll note, I went to see President Biden speak at the National Constitution Center in Philadelphia a few months ago during the summer about this. And he said in his speech that he regarded this as the most severe threat to American democracy since the Civil War. Extraordinary words. The question is, will the action follow? And I was a little discomfited by the following thing that happened. Before Biden came out, the president came out to speak, they weren't playing Hail to the Chief, so it seemed a little slapped together at the last minute. They played a soundtrack of classic rock. And whoever did it thought that the song that should precede the president walking out was We Won't Get Fooled Again by The Who, which, as you know, is a song about dashed revolutionary expectations. Meet the new boss, same as the old boss. And then Biden walked out to talk about H.R. 1. So I was a little worried about that. But we have reason to hope. And the one thing I would say as we look at the extraordinary inspiration of the New Deal and the inspiration of being with so many people who have it in their blood, we're always looking for usable history. I want to suggest that the usable history here comes from several eras of American history. Yes, it comes from the New Deal, from the ambition and the understanding of power in our society, the understanding, as Roosevelt said in 1936, when he drew the line at his convention speech between fighting against British monarchy, fighting against economic royalists, and fighting against fascists at that moment, and for democracy. We need that ambition. We also need the understanding from another era, the Reconstruction era, where the Republican Party took the lead, that our racial divisions and racism aimed especially at African Americans is not something we can ignore as we push for progress, but must be fully addressed as part of the solution. And we saw that in the second Reconstruction as well during the Great Society. And the final thing I would suggest, and I don't know if this is bad form, that we look to the era of another branch of the family, the progressive era of Theodore Roosevelt, where they had many of the same social issues, many of the same corruption issues in government and failures of the political system. And they understood then that democracy reform had to be at the center of politics for years to come to save the country. If we do that, I actually am optimistic.
Thank you, Michael. Teddy Roosevelt actually signed in 1906 the first law, the only law, totally banning corporate contributions to political campaigns. That's how far we've come. So now, to move from the realm of the possible to the realm of the impossible, what do we do about all this?
Well, hopefully not impossible. I hope that's not the impression that I leave you with, but certainly very difficult. And I don't want to downplay the difficulties. But I want to say thank you, Scott, for having me and for hosting this great event. It's a pleasure to be here. I think I just want to quickly sort of frame this up by talking about, I think I'm here to talk about the how of how we pass things, and what about how we pass things is different now than it was during the New Deal era, and what is the same. And so I would sort of focus on one big thing that's different about how we pass laws in this country now, and one thing that is the same. Neither of those things are good. So I'm just going to say that up front. The first thing is what's different, and what's different is the idea that you need more than a majority to pass bills in the Senate. And by dint of needing more than a majority to pass bills in the Senate, you need more than a majority to make a law at all. There are lots of arguments against the filibuster. There is a constitutional argument that it is unconstitutional, because by evolving its rules in this way, the Senate has changed the nature of our entire system unilaterally, simply by changing its own rules from a system where we were majority rule all the way through to one where you have to have a supermajority to pass a bill. And I think that's a very good argument. It hasn't gotten far enough in the courts, but I think the substance is correct. And I just want to dwell on this for a second, because I think it has become so commonplace for us to accept that it takes 60 votes to pass things in the Senate, that it's hard to sort of process how different this is than from the way it used to be. So I'm going to zoom back to the founding era briefly, and then I will zoom forward back to the New Deal era to get at what's the same. The framers were very, very clear that they did not want there to be a supermajority threshold anywhere in our system of government, except for a few extraordinary circumstances that they identified and wrote into the Constitution. These were constitutional amendments, removal from office, and treaties were the main areas where you would need a supermajority threshold. This wasn't an issue that they sort of did as a drive-by or in passing. They gave it extensive consideration. They were very attuned to the question of whether there should be a supermajority threshold in the legislature, because, as we all know, the Constitution was version 2.0 of American government, and version 1.0 was the Articles of Confederation. The Articles of Confederation did have a supermajority threshold in its legislature, and it was put there for all the reasons that you hear people defend the filibuster today, which is the idea that a supermajority threshold would promote consensus and compromise. But in practice, what the framers saw under the Articles was that it did the opposite. It created gridlock, and it allowed a minority to wield veto power over everything the majority wanted to do. So they were very tuned into this issue when they were writing the Constitution. They debated it extensively at the Constitutional Convention. They wrote about it extensively in the Federalist Papers. And they were extremely clear that while they wanted to build in lots of protections for minority factions into the Constitution and into the Senate itself, those protections for minority factions were designed to give the minority input, to give it a role in the legislative process, to make sure that it could have extensive debate in the Senate, but that at the end of the day, if those protections failed to give the minority the ability to persuade the other side to come around to their argument, at the end of the day, whatever the issue was should come up for a majority rule vote and pass or fail on that basis. And there's simply no ambiguity about this point. James Madison, who conservatives like to cite as the sort of chief advocate for minority protections in the Constitution, was extremely clear about this. He considered it a matter of principle. He called majority rule the Republican, small r Republican, principle in Federalist Number 10. So, this was also backed up by more than a century of practice. This isn't just sort of theory that was then discarded quickly. The Senate, all the way up into the 20th century, was a majority rule institution. It just was. So, think of any bill that passed the Senate from its founding up until about the 1960s, with the exception of civil rights bills, which I'll talk about in a second. It passed on a majority rule vote. That includes every piece of New Deal legislation. The filibuster simply was not used very often, and it wasn't used to impose a supermajority threshold. To the extent that it was used, it was the sort of Jimmy Stewart-style filibuster that we think of, that Jonathan was talking about on the last panel of a senator, going to the floor and talking for a long time. That was useful to delay a bill, but it did not impose a supermajority threshold. The senator would eventually stop talking, and whatever bill was being delayed would come up for a vote at a majority threshold. We think about the golden age of the Senate and great compromise. The Missouri Compromise passed by 2 votes. So if there had to be a supermajority threshold, it never would have passed. So that's what's different. What's different is this idea that we need a supermajority, that we need 60 votes to pass things in the Senate. That was not the case for the vast majority of the Senate's existence, including the New Deal era. What's the same is that civil rights bills need a supermajority to pass. During the entire Jim Crow era, which of course spans the New Deal era, the only bills that were consistently required to pass a supermajority threshold were civil rights bills. How did they do this? Well, a rule was introduced in 1917, for the first time putting a rule on the books that could be manipulated into requiring a supermajority threshold. It was called Rule 22. It's the rule we're dealing with today and trying to reform the filibuster. It was a rule to impose what they call cloture or end debate. And that ending debate was a supermajority threshold vote. So even today, when we're talking about supermajority thresholds, it's that cloture vote. It's an intermediate vote. It's not the vote to pass or fail a bill. Under Senate rules today, the passage of a bill is still majority vote. It's that intermediate cloture vote that the bills can't clear to get to that final passage vote that imposes the supermajority requirement. So the only bills that were forced to clear that supermajority requirement from the end of Reconstruction through the 1960s were civil rights bills. When filibusters were applied to other bills, they were the Jimmy Stewart-style filibuster. People talked for a while, the issues were resolved, or the senators gave up, and those bills came up and passed or failed on a simple majority. Civil rights bills alone were required to clear a supermajority every single time, and that is why they mostly failed during this period. What we have now is a system where we've figured out a workaround around the filibuster that we call reconciliation, which allows many categories of legislation to come up and pass or fail on a simple majority vote. Reconciliation is a relatively new thing. It was created in the 1980s. It was never used to pass big legislation of the kind that we're talking about today, but people have gotten so fed up with the filibuster that they've started using it and expanded its scope through a series of procedural changes and precedents that have been set over the past few decades, so that now we can pass multi-trillion-dollar bills through reconciliation. But what we've basically done is created a majority rule pathway for many categories of legislation, arguably most categories of legislation. That pathway doesn't include civil rights. And so what you're seeing under the Biden administration is a similar dynamic to what we had under the New Deal era, where bills on the economy, on climate change, on many other topics are able to pass or fail on a majority vote. The only bills that don't have the privilege of a majority rule vote are civil rights bills. Not the only bills, but the biggest category of bills today that don't receive a majority rule vote are civil rights bills. And so what's unfortunate about this dynamic is a similar situation where we can do lots of things through reconciliation. We can do lots of things through majority rule votes. We can pass up to $5 trillion in government spending, as we've done this year between the things that are on the table now and the American Rescue Plan that passed back in March. But we can't pass civil rights bills, and we can't pass voting rights bills. And that dynamic, where there's essentially a two-tiered system where many things get to pass or fail on a majority rule vote, but civil rights are forced to live or die by the filibuster and by a supermajority threshold, is what's the same. So I started off by saying neither of these things are good. They are both unfortunate, but hopefully they can change. It only takes 50 senators plus the vice president to change the filibuster. Like Michael, I'm optimistic that we will get there. I'm sure this will come up in the Q&A, which I want to stop and move to, but it is possible to change this. We just need senators who have the political will to do it. So I'll end on that somewhat uplifting and optimistic note and turn it back over to you, Scott.
So there's a lot tossed out here, a lot of rich topics for discussion. Let's do a Q&A. Keep your questions as brief as possible, and the panelists will keep their responses as quick as possible to allow the most participation. So a question in the room? Sure, go ahead.
Just in regards to Mr. Waldman's plea for usable history, I have a question for David Reimer, do you see the 1945 full employment bill, not the version that was passed in 46, but the 45 version, in terms of instituting mechanisms to maintain full employment as a model for what you're talking about for an agency?
Well, I haven't read that legislation in a long time, so it's hard to directly
Right.
respond to your question. But I think, to me, the model in some ways is where President Roosevelt and Secretary Perkins and Harry Hopkins and others, Henry Wallace was on the Committee of Economic Security. That is, I think, the starting point for answering your question. What came out of that, not all in one piece of legislation, but what came out of the logic of that was the WPA, a massive jobs program at its height, 3 to 4 million unemployed people put to work, with, again, the jobs themselves being the primary focus, but then a lot of useful projects, many involving conservation. Behind that was, I think, the belief of Hopkins and some others that there ought to be a right to a job if you can't find one. Connected to that was legislation that didn't pass until 38, which is the Fair Labor Standards Act. For workers, there should be a decent wage. Going back to the Social Security Act, for people who had worked enough to build up enough credit, there would be unemployment insurance. That was actually, we think of Social Security old age pensions as the jewel in the crown of the law, but what kicked in first was unemployment insurance, so a temporary income source while you're looking for work. Ideas like disability insurance were promoted, dropped, later put back in, I think in 1952, if I have the year right. Old age pensions, of course, for people who had already worked. The point of all this is that the logic of this was a comprehensive set of policies to help adult workers in all their relationships with the labor market. Unemployed, employed, retired, with a disability. The logic extends to paid leave. You know, you can't get paid leave unless you're leaving a job you have and are planning, presumably, to return to that job. So I think all of these elements were talked about back then, except possibly paid leave. Many of them were included in 1935 in the Social Security Act, or came pretty quickly. Collective bargaining was part of it, the Wagner Act later in 35. How much of that was in the 45 law, I can't answer that.
Another question in the room? Tomlin.
Hi, this question is for Adam. I think it's pretty clear that the Freedom to Vote Act would be vulnerable to the filibuster, but then if it is, or since it is, will you think a carve-out will be done to make that passage possible?
It's interesting. I think that I think, you know, I'm less optimistic than I was at the beginning of the year, but I'm still pretty optimistic. And I'm not actually sure that it will be a carve-out. I think it might be a return to the talking filibuster. And it's interesting how this plays, because I sort of started the year talking about the talking filibuster, and then people sort of went to the carve-out, and then I feel like we're circling back to talking filibuster now. And it's because the talking filibuster, you know, Joe Manchin needs to be the hero of his own narrative here, and he needs to be, you know, this can't be a radical shift. It has to be a restoration of some kind for reform to happen. And, you know, a carve-out, you know, nobody believes it's really a carve-out is the problem with it. Because once you make a carve-out, everybody knows, you know, your rationale is legitimate. It's that, you know, nothing is more essential than democracy, or than, you know, voting rights and access to the ballot, which is a perfectly reasonable argument. But everybody knows that once you start making carve-outs, you're going to continue making carve-outs. I mean, look at what we're doing with reconciliation, where this was never supposed to be used this way, and now we're passing $5 trillion in spending through it. So you know, it feels more like cheating. Whereas restoring the talking filibuster sort of has the aura of a restoration, of going back to the Jimmy Stewart, of sort of getting back to what the founders did intend the Senate to do. They didn't intend, you know, the filibuster didn't exist until the 1850s or so, But getting back to the idea of unlimited debate, there was supposed to be a role for the minority to stand on the floor, have a platform to articulate their ideas, and the Senate was supposed to provide that in a way the House was not. And restoring the talking filibuster would sort of, you could argue, restores that aspect of Senate tradition. So I'm optimistic that there's going to be a reform. I think we're probably headed for a showdown over that after Build Back Better and BIF, the reconciliation bill, pass, which hopefully they will in the next few weeks. So I think that's when we'll know. But I think that if there is reform during that period at the end of the year, maybe we have, it's called the nuclear option when you do the reform. So maybe we'll have a nuclear winter here. But I think the more likely reform is probably a return to the talking filibuster, which is good because it will allow the Freedom to Vote Act to pass, but also open the door for other things like DC statehood or other reforms that are essential to restoring our democratic system.
This is huge. Let me, Michael has a question for Adam, and then we'll go to a Zoom question.
Well, it relates to the talking filibuster because looking at it instrumentally, they could talk and need 41 votes, but with enough willpower, a minority can still stop the majority. So I want to ask your view of a version of the talking filibuster, which used to be proposed by Senator Harkin and Senator Joe Lieberman, which was, in effect, the first cloture vote, you need 60 votes. The second one, you need 57 votes. The third one, you need 53. But eventually, after many weeks, maybe, of debate, a majority can prevail.
Yeah, the ratcheting down. Yeah, that's something that is being discussed. Senator Merkley basically has an idea that's similar to that. That's a version of the Harkin proposal. And what Michael's talking about is, we all are we have the Jimmy Stewart example. We're familiar with these sort of dramatic examples of a single senator, Strom Thurmond in the 1957 Voting Rights Act, holding the floor for a long time. But those actually weren't that effective because one senator can only talk for so long, and you basically just wait them out and then pass the bill like later that day or the next day. What were really effective and the type of filibusters that did derail civil rights bills were when you coordinated with multiple people, and so you had, people passing the baton back and forth, and you could basically keep it going indefinitely. And so obviously there are 50 Republicans in the Senate. They could coordinate amongst themselves and keep a talking filibuster against a voting rights bill going indefinitely. So you need a enforcement mechanism to cut off that debate at a certain point. And this gets back to the framers' intent, which was the Senate originally had a bunch of different enforcement mechanisms. There was supposed to be extensive debate in the Senate, but when that debate veered from an attempt at persuasion into an attempt at obstruction, there were supposed to be ways for senators to cut it off. There were a bunch of different rules. One of them they accidentally got rid of in 1806 because nobody used it because it was sort of accepted that senators would wrap it up in a reasonable amount of time. So what Michael's describing is, you start at the 60 vote cloture threshold, then after a period of time, on the principle that the minority should have time to debate, you ratchet it down to 55, and then after another period of time, say a week, you ratchet it down to 50, so that eventually you have an enforcement mechanism where you have a talking filibuster, but you have a method by which a majority can eventually cut it off after the minority is given their time to speak. So I think that is under discussion. The thing about Senate rules is it's basically Calvin ball. You can write them however you want if you have a majority behind to establish them. So, they could start it without that enforcement mechanism. They could add it later. We'll see where it goes. But I think realistically, on the big ticket items, you are going to need some kind of enforcement mechanism behind a talking filibuster to actually get things like the voting rights bill passed.
Mac, we'll wrap up with a Zoom question. Or some.
Michael Warburton, who is one of the 170 people joining us on Zoom at the moment, among others, is wondering a question that pertains to two of these topics. Will climate change and the effort to counter it, with climate change and the effort to counter it, isn't there more than enough work for everyone who wants it?
I agree, absolutely is the answer. The challenge is to set up the systems, the structures, appropriate the funds, figure out exactly which people are paid which dollar amount, with which equipment, with materials, special clothing in some cases, under which supervision, make sure the money is properly spent. It's an organizational matter. We've talked a lot here about policy, as we should, but it's also important to remember that part of the success of the New Deal, a part of the brilliance of Franklin Roosevelt as president, was his choice of extraordinarily competent administrators Frances Perkins, yes, was the first woman to hold a cabinet position. She was also an amazing, brilliant administrator as well as political figure in her own way. Ditto Henry Wallace, ditto Harry Hopkins. Harold Ickes was often criticized for being too good an administrator, taking too much time making sure every T was crossed. So I think when it comes to climate change and other conservation of resources challenges, the problem is not a shortage of tasks to be done or people to perform those tasks. The challenge is the money and the organizational structure.
So the big follow-up question to that, David, is if they get $550 billion for climate, does the president have executive authority to assign these jobs to fix climate change, or is he going to need legislation that is subject to a filibuster?
Well, I think, and again, correct me if I'm wrong, but the way I read it, certainly the money for the Civilian Climate Corps is appropriated to specific departments of the federal government for specific purposes. I won't go into the details. We could if you had more time, but I don't think the president has to do anything more other than say, I appointed you Secretary of Agriculture, Labor, Commerce. Here's the money. It's legally yours. Spend it. There are probably, however, other things that would require executive action, such as creating a coordinating council. That isn't in the law, I don't believe. But they can do it without the law. That's where executive authority would come in, as it did, I believe, for President Roosevelt, who created any number of coordinating bodies. So yes, we will need some executive action to be sure it's not a hot mess administratively, but once the money is appropriated to named agencies, that's the heaviest lift.
Thank you all very much. We will take a 3-minute break and come back with another fascinating video and our final panel. Thank you all.
In another era, when our democracy was tested, Franklin Roosevelt reminded us, in America, we do our part. We all do our part. That's all I'm asking, that we do our part, all of us.
Hello, I'm June Hopkins, granddaughter of Harry Hopkins, who was one of FDR's closest advisors throughout his presidency. During the crisis years of the Great Depression, my grandfather's primary concern was to provide jobs for the vast army of unemployed Americans. He helped create and administer one of the most successful and popular New Deal programs, the Works Progress Administration. During World War II, he administered the Lend-Lease program, providing war materials for our allies. Defeating fascism for him was merely an extension of his work for social and economic justice in the United States. In June 2020, as America was descending into unprecedented crises, historic pandemic, soaring unemployment, climate crisis, and rising threats to our democracy, I joined a group of concerned citizens. We were united by our alarm at the parallels between the crisis then and now, and our hope for a return to bold, pro-people government solutions. The group wrote to Joe Biden asking him if he were to become president to aim even higher than the New Deal. We felt he could be as transformative as FDR in restoring faith in a government that works for ordinary Americans. Since that letter, the group meets regularly and has appeared in dozens of print and digital media. The group I was proud to join last June are the children and grandchildren of Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt, Henry Wallace, Frances Perkins, Harold Ickes, and my grandfather, Harry Hopkins. Our ancestors saw the suffering of the American people and felt that government had a pivotal role to play in countering the devastating effects of a great economic depression. They fervently believed in the dignity of a job at a living wage. And if the private sector could not provide this, then the US government should be the employer of last resort. They recognized that if they didn't deliver Americans the basics of a decent life, like retirement security, labor protections, and essentials like schools, hospitals, electricity, and transportation infrastructure, Americans might lose faith and be seduced by the empty promises of an unaccountable autocracy. Our purpose is to now remind the American people and our elected representatives that bold, concerted government activism has saved the day before and can and must do it again. I'll now hand it over to my friend David Reimer and to my fellow New Deal descendants for a discussion of how the past can illuminate the future. Thank you.
Well, good afternoon. My name is David Reimer, and I'm pleased to serve as the moderator of our final session. I did want to briefly mention Harold Ickes was unfortunately unable to join us today. Harold has been an active participant in the group's work for over 15 months. He's not here in person, but he's here in spirit and shares his solidarity and commitment with what this group has been seeking to do for that stretch of time. The members of this panel have already been introduced, so no further introductions are necessary. And what I'm going to do is ask each of them a personal question, and then after we've gone through that, I'd like to ask all of them the same common core question that lies at the heart of what this program is all about. To keep us on track, I'll be I'm going to ask people to keep their responses to 2 to 3 minutes. And Stephen Seufert is going to help me. If anyone on the panel sees his red folder raised in the air, that means it's time to stop, and we're going to keep strict time. I should just briefly introduce Stephen. If you could raise the red folder, stand up. Stephen is the one who brought this group together, has been very active in pulling this whole program together. I want to acknowledge him. So I want to begin by asking Jim Roosevelt. Jim, you've known about your grandfather and the New Deal all of your life, but you actually knew your grandmother in person because she lived until you were a senior in high school. How did her goals shape your view of the New Deal and your own personal commitments?
Well, thanks, David, and thanks for everything that you've contributed here. Let me just say first that I hope on the Zoom, June could hear the applause for her message. I think she so well summed up what we're about here today. I'm also sorry that my friend Harold Ickes was not able to be here today. Most of us directly involved in this effort are grandchildren of New Deal participants. Harold is the son of a New Deal participant, which is really quite remarkable given that we're in 2021. And he is still in there fighting for democracy. He's on the rules, has been on the Rules and Bylaws Committee that I co-chair at the Democratic National Committee. We don't always agree, but we have great respect and affection for each other, even when he's told me I'm destroying the Democratic Party. Then we have a beer. So I'm sorry he's not here today. But to go to the question that you've posed, David, I did have some of my cousins who are a little bit older than I am, had as very young children the opportunity to know President Roosevelt personally, including my 2 older sisters, who one of whom actually passed away last week, I'm sorry to say. But most of the cousins of my generation had in varying degrees the opportunity to know my grandmother, Eleanor Roosevelt. And so my view of the New Deal, actually my view of democracy and justice is something I grew up with from my grandmother. Some cousins had more contact with her because they lived here in the New York City area. I grew up in Southern California, but she was famous for at the time, she traveled so often. I would see her several times a year when she'd come through Los Angeles, and then periodically we would come to New York City. Not New York City, New York State, to Hyde Park in the summertime and visit with her. But the real transmission to me of her view of the New Deal, as well as her view of our right place in the universe. Came to me from my father and my mother, but also from her 6-day-a-week newspaper column called My Day, which she actually dictated herself every day. It wasn't ghostwritten. I mean, full-time newspaper columnists don't write 6 days a week anymore. And she would do that every day. And what I would get from that is her continual focus, first of all, on real people. And FDR referred to her as his eyes and ears. And that's because she was intent on getting around the country and then in wartime around the world, talking to real people, not just analyzing programs or statistics or policies, but talking to real people. One of the things that impressed me with that fact, I mean, I read it every day. From the time I actually think I learned to read reading her newspaper column, and I kind of thought as about a 4.5-year-old, I thought that's how everyone stayed in touch with their grandmother, if their grandmother didn't live locally. But she wrote about real people and their real problems and their real feelings every single day, 6 days a week. And she definitely had policy views, whether they were on civil rights or jobs or the communities that people lived in. She was a big sponsor of the utopian towns that were developed, like Roosevelt, New Jersey, and Greenbelt, Maryland, and so on. But again, she focused on real people and the situations that they lived in. The theme, I think, about her concern for real people was human rights. And that is symbolized and culminated in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which became her focus after the death of the president. As has been widely reported, but I like to recall every now and then, she's the only sort of rank and file delegate who's ever received a standing ovation from the entire UN General Assembly when she spoke about that. So that human rights of real humans were what her life was about, whether it was civil rights or women's rights. We would characterize those rights in more categorically today than she would have then, but she did that in her life and in what she advocated for. And so that attitude and that fundamental set of principles is what I think gets us to what we today, as we have had to do in every crisis in my lifetime, what we need to focus on in what we are pushing for in legislation and administration and policy and even statistical record keeping for that matter. So that's how she influenced my view of what we're talking about here.
Thank you. Thank you, Jim. Thank you. I want to turn now to Tomlin Perkins Coggeshall. Tomlin, your grandmother had a long-term relationship with FDR, part of which occurred in this building, which helped her accomplish that long list of objectives that she presented to President-elect Roosevelt to help end the Great Depression. How do you feel that their personal relationship between your grandmother and President Roosevelt, or even before he became president, played a role in their accomplishments?
Thank you, David. Yeah, I'd like to discover, sort of discover with you the length of her relationship back to her role in New York City and then New York State government as a commissioner of labor eventually. But before there was a commissioner of labor position, it was a member of the Industrial Commission is what it was called. And So in 1919, Al Smith appointed her to be on that commission a year before women had the right to vote nationally. And so she did that and excelled at it. And over the years, I think there was one term when Al Smith wasn't in office, but she stayed right with it all the way till 28 when he ran for president. And by that time, she had become the chair of that commission. So when FDR was elected in 28 to be governor of New York, he inherited my grandmother as the chair of that commission. And quite soon, he seemed to, proclaim that we don't need a whole commission. Why don't you be the commissioner, Francis? I'm not quite sure how that step happened, but it did. So then they had 4 years together until 1932 to deal with the onslaught of the Depression here in New York State. And they became friends as well, and developed trust, I think, too. I'm sure. So when they went on after the meeting in this house upstairs, where she read her list of demands or things that she wanted to work on if she was going to be Secretary of Labor, she did have a very nice job here in New York State, though. First with those 4 years with FDR, and then Herbert Lehman was the next governor elected. And recently we found in the attic in Maine, her family homestead, a certificate where Herbert Lehman is appointing her to be labor commissioner in New York State in 1933. So in January. So clearly she had that in her head or in her pocketbook when she came down here to talk to FDR. And she knew what he was going to ask. There were many women of the Democratic Division Party who were telling her, damn it, Francis, if you don't do this, I'll kill you, something. And so she felt a lot of pressure. And Eleanor was, I know, helping convince FDR that it would be a good idea to invite her. And so she was a little bit torn because she had my mom and her husband here in New York and her great job. But so she wrote the list of shooting for the moon, kind of, to get what she really thought needed to be accomplished. And she might have also been hoping he would say, I don't know, Francis, it's a little bit too much. But no, he said, great, let's do it. And so she did it. And so that's how, and then they got an awful lot done, of course. And that's how, I think, based on their trust and friendship, they worked very well together. And she had great ideas, and so did he, and it harmonized well.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Two of the panelists here are not either children or grandchildren. They're great-grandchildren. And I'm going to now turn to them, beginning with David Giffen. He is the great-grandson of Harry Hopkins and the son of June Hopkins, who we heard on the video. David, how did your knowledge of your great-grandfather, Harry Hopkins, how did your knowledge of his life and work impact your own work here in New York and perhaps elsewhere in dealing with the issue of homelessness, which is, I know the center of gravity of your work here in the city?
Thank you, David, and thank you for including me in this group. There are sort of two parallel courses or lines that influenced my life coming from Harry Hopkins and the New Dealers. One is on the personal side and one is more on the policy side. On the personal side, obviously we grew up in our household hearing quite a lot about Harry Hopkins. The Hopkins clan is a big family, and there were many stories told about him. And I grew up hearing about this guy I was related to, who was so influential in the country, who was always referred to as such a great administrator. And I'd get these looks of expectation from my family about honoring a great administrator. And I'm 5 years old thinking, this is what I want to be when I grow up, a great administrator. And then as I got older, I began to understand what that means. And what it meant was this was somebody who had this facility for moving vast amounts of resources very quickly into the hands of people who need them. And that did spark my curiosity to learn more about the man and why he did what he did and what exactly he did. And fortunately, my mother is a historian, so I was able to get that knowledge. And what really struck me about him was that he was not driven by ambition, he was driven by compassion. And the work that he did in his early career as a social worker in New York is really what inspired and informed everything he did in his life. And that's something I think that all of the New Dealers share, as opposed to so much of what we see today in government. This wasn't a bunch of people in the White House circling the wagons to defend some political ideology. This was a group of people who honestly wanted to help suffering Americans and do it immediately. And that's a very inspiring model of government. But then, you know, when I was 9, 10 years old and first started to pay attention to politics, it was, you know, Richard Nixon and Watergate. And then I'm in college and seeing the Reagan administration. And it was very hard to reconcile those two things. That, well, this was the version of government I heard about growing up, but this is what I'm actually witnessing that is pretty far away from that. And as a result, it never even crossed my mind that somebody who would want to do something to help people in need would go into the public sector. And I'm sad about that because I think there's probably a whole generation of people who might have entered government work but who didn't because of the cynicism that was fostered by witnessing those types of administrations. And I admit this is a slightly partisan panel we're on here, so I'm probably not going to get a lot of argument on that. But when it comes into what do you do about it, you know, there's a very famous line by Harry Hopkins when a particular program, a relief program, was being described as being very slow to start, but would be good for people in the long run. He famously quipped, well, people don't eat in the long run, they eat every day. And it's a great response, right? It's a great comeback, but it was also one that really did resonate with me because when you strip away all of the politics and the policies, what really matters is helping people and helping them now. And that is what led me, you know, when I started working at the Coalition for the Homeless back in the late 80s, it was by running the soup kitchen. It has a mobile soup kitchen that feeds about 1,000 people a day. And that was making sure people eat every single day. And I'm very sincerely acknowledging that that was informed by the lessons I heard about my great-grandfather. Then more on the policy side, you know, the New York State Constitution was amended, was revised in 1938. And that was a result of everything that the New Dealers had been doing, and this acknowledgement, this revolutionary acknowledgement that, hey, maybe it is the role of government to take care of those who are in need. In the New York State Constitutional Convention of 1938, one of the articles introduced to the Constitution was Article 17, that explicitly states the aid, care, and support of the needy are public concerns that shall be addressed by the state, essentially. Not could be, should be, shall be. It is that provision of the New York State Constitution that a piece of litigation in 1981 was based on. Actually, it was brought in 1979 and settled in 1981, called the Callahan Consent Decree. A lawsuit, Callahan versus Carey, was brought by a lawyer named Bob Hayes, based on that article in the state constitution, saying that the state has an obligation to shelter people who are homeless. As a result of that, New York City has now, still today, a legal right to shelter. That right was later expanded to include homeless families as well as single adults, men and women. And it was around that litigation that the Coalition for the Homeless that I now run was founded. So that's the sort of policy through line of the New Dealers to the New York State Constitutional Convention, to Article 17, to Callahan v. Carey, and we're still fighting these battles today. And you know, the one lesson I think we come from that is when we have these victories, when we have a litigation victory or a legislation victory, that's not the end of the battle, that's the start of the battle. Because once we get those, and we still have to make sure that they are adhered to, and the people who are supposed to get help, get help.
Thank you. Phoebe Roosevelt, another great-grandchild, great-granddaughter of FDR and Eleanor. You never met them, but you've been an American history teacher and a public interest lawyer, and you now serve on the board of the Roosevelt Institute, which is mentioned up here, a progressive think tank that's one of the sponsors of this event. For you, what is most significant about the Roosevelt's legacy today?
Thank you. First, I want to give a little shout out to my dad and my sister who are also here. My dad is one of those older cousins that Jim mentioned earlier. And his name is Frank Roosevelt, and my sister Amelia Roosevelt are here in the audience. So I want to acknowledge these other descendants here. I'm going to answer your question about what's significant to me personally about the Roosevelt's legacy in three parts. The first part has been the subject of today's conference, which is really the role of government. And I thought that June Hopkins said it so beautifully. I wrote it down while I was listening to her right here. It's a pro-people government solutions. And to me, I really see that role of government as an important counterweight to the private interests of businesses, and that we really need to have a society that has a pro-people government and a more private. They need to balance each other out, and I really do think that the New Deal and the legacy of the Roosevelts is emphasizing the importance of government in that role. The second thing that I would take that's significant to me about their legacy is really does come from Eleanor, also, as Jim mentioned for his comments. I feel that Eleanor not only saw a duty of government to its citizens, but also really emphasized the importance of citizens' engagement with their government, that citizens have a duty to be responsive and in a way to be active and engaged to give government the power to take care of, to be that pro-people government. And I think that her sort of advocacy or nudging everybody to, if not be as engaged as she was in all the issues, at least to learn about the issues and to go vote and to participate in government at all levels. And then the third thing that I find significant about their legacy is both of their ability to listen and adapt. And I think it's telling that we're here on a panel with Brain Trust descendants that, but it also applied to listening to regular people, but it also applied to their ability to adapt to the changing circumstances and the exigencies of the time they were living in. And I really think both of them evolved in their thinking on things. They evolved in their concerns and their solutions. And I think in that way they were both critical thinkers, and I would almost say they had a scientific approach to problem solving that I really admire and I think is important for politics and society.
Thank you. Several people on the dais here played important roles in pulling this event together, as well as several people out in the audience, but I think it's fair to say that Scott Wallace was the key organizer and architect of this event. So before I even ask him a question, I want to thank him for that and ask other people to thank him for that. So Scott, the programs that your grandfather designed as Secretary of Agriculture were cornerstones of the New Deal. Talk about how his thinking would apply today to the problems we face today.
Thank you, David. I think it's incredibly relevant today. He believed in an activist federal government, that it should be on the side of ordinary working people, especially at a time of great crisis, which is what they inherited. You know, I'll echo what Jim said about Eleanor. He was a huge fan of Eleanor. They were kindred spirits in the need for the New Deal to continue and not just not disappear after the war. She was a big fan of his. She convinced the 1940 convention to keep him on the ticket. FDR said, "I'm not going to run if I don't get Henry Wallace," and the convention was not too sure about that, and she went and gave her speech. This is no ordinary time. You got to give him what he wants. My kindred spirit, Frances Perkins. I love the story about my grandfather and her arriving late to the inauguration in March of 1933, and they were both locked out because they didn't have proper identification, and they sat behind the chain link fence looking in from the outside. That's why you don't see them in the photographs. But my grandfather believed that the Department of Agriculture was an incredibly important agency for the American people. You know, as recently as 1890, 90% of the American people lived on the land. And by the 1930s, it was down to 50%, but now it's down to 3%. The Secretary of Agriculture was an incredibly important person in the lives of ordinary people. And he said, well, we've got to help not only with financial security and economic welfare, and he served on the panel with Frances Perkins that designed Social Security, but also we have to protect natural resources. And that's why our foundation, the Wallace Global Fund, is focused big time on climate, the current greatest natural resource challenge. The twin things we have to protect. So he was big on the Civilian Conservation Corps, soil conservation. He invented the soil conservation program, but he also invented the school lunch program because a lot of kids weren't getting any nutrition at all during the day, and school was one place they could get it. He invented food stamps because there are families that are so needy they can't feed themselves. So it was a human challenge and a planetary challenge, and I think that's incredibly relevant today. What we're trying to do with the Build Back Better plan is take care of the planet. $550 billion ain't nothing. And try to take care of the human infrastructure that Joe Biden talks about that enables the economic growth and independence of Americans. So I'm inspired every day by his focus on that and the incredible importance, the role of the federal government in enabling and empowering this.
Thank you. One of Shakespeare's characters says, what's past is prologue. So we're going to wrap up this panel by asking each of the panelists, kind of have a lightning round, because I want to be sure we leave plenty of time for Q&A from the audience and our Zoom audience. So I'm going to ask the following question to each of you, same question. See if you can answer it in about a minute. What is your biggest takeaway from the New Deal that shapes what you think about government's role today? We'll begin with Tomlin, skip over to David and Phoebe, then back to Scott, and we'll finish with Jim Roosevelt. Tomlin.
Okay, thanks, David. It's hard to pin down one thing. I guess the fact that it was done and it worked so well, paves the way for us to repeat and to maybe even improve. But we've proven it's doable. So come on, guys, let's go.
Thank you. David?
Sure. Yeah, I do think there's one kind of fundamental difference between the New Deal then and the New Deal now. What it would be now, in that the problems that it was trying to address then were precipitated by some structural collapse, right? By the economic systems we had failing. The problems it's trying to address now are from the economic systems we have in place actually working, right? That the systems that are in place are not meant to protect people and ensure that they have access to food and to housing and to jobs and to health care. And so while we do need a relief program, and even the pared down program that we're looking at now is immensely helpful and is more than I ever thought we would ever see coming from our government, and I'm very, very thankful for it. But we do need to remember that we still have some structural problems that we have to address unless we're going to be begging for a New Deal 4 or 10 years from now.
So, Figi, you've talked about this a little, but what's the single biggest takeaway from the New Deal that shapes what you think government's role is today?
So I think that I wanted to raise the point that was raised a little bit earlier by Michael Waldman, which is that the role of government is really shaped by voters, and that so I was going to spend my time talking about how important it is to, as he was alluding to have voting access, and also for people who do have the right to vote to exercise it. And I thought we had 2 to 3 minutes, and I found a quote from FDR that is so good. So if you don't mind, I would like to read that about voting rights.
Unless someone on the panel wants to invoke cloture, you have 1 more minute.
Yeah. Oh. Okay. Because I do think voting is key to being able to define the role of government. So he said, and this was unfortunately in his campaign for his 4th term, which is a problem, but we're just not going to talk about that right now. He said, "Nobody will ever deprive the American people of the right to vote except the American people themselves, and the only way they could do that is by not voting at all." This is a little bit of a long quote. "It is true," he goes on, "that there are many undemocratic defects in voting laws in the various states. Almost 48 different kinds of defects," and he uses that number because at that time there were only 48 states. "And some of these produce injustices which prevent a full and free expression of public opinion. The right to vote must be open to our citizens, irrespective of race, color, or creed, without tax or artificial restriction of any kind. The sooner we get to that basis of political equality, the better it will be for the country as a whole." He continues, I'm sorry. "During this past year, there were politicians and others who quite openly worked to restrict the use of the ballot in this election, hoping selfishly for a small vote. The full and free exercise of our sacred right to vote is more important in the long run than the personal hopes or ambitions of any candidate for any office in the land. It is therefore all the more important that we not be smackers." That is his word. "We not be smackers on registration day or on election day." So I'd never heard the term smackers before.
Scott Wallace?
Okay, maybe that was a typo. Maybe it was slackers. I don't know. But let me build on that. To vote, I mean, FDR had wind beneath his wings when he wanted to accomplish something. He had the huge labor support, especially at the beginning. He had the people who were fed up with the depression and the economic deprivation. The Citizens Army, the bonus army that came and occupied Washington, D.C., was an enormous movement that empowered FDR at the beginning. It takes a movement. We need movements now to lift up the people to vote and to lift up these various issues that are percolating through Congress. There's the famous story you've all heard about a labor leader, Sidney Hillman, going to FDR and saying, here's what you need to do. And FDR said, well, I agree with you. Now make me do it. And who was it who said, power concedes nothing without a demand? Frederick Douglass. We need all of us to empower, to lift up these movements, especially of young people who are saying, you know, you old people are messing up my planet. And look at the progress they have made in getting $550 billion in climate funding into this reconciliation package. These movements we need to recognize and support and celebrate and lift up. Our foundation gave our second annual Henry A. Wallace Award to the Sunrise Movement for elevating climate. So a word in favor of movements.
And last but not least, Jim Roosevelt, what's your biggest takeaway from the New Deal that shapes what you think about government's role today?
Well, I think it's hard for us today to grasp how cataclysmic the Great Depression was. We know that today we have the skinniest safety net of any industrial country. They had no safety net prior to the New Deal. Everything we've heard about today didn't exist then, prior to Francis Perkins and the New Deal. So they had nothing to fall back on. But remember, if you take the Depression starting from 1929 on, only 10 to 11 years before, they had the equivalent of the pandemic as well. Although the numbers are different because the population was different, the Spanish flu had the same kind of effect on society that the pandemic is having today. So you put those together and you see what happens when a society, when a country faces really existential devastation. We did it a little in reverse order this time. We had the near collapse of the economic system in 2008, 2009. Congress did too little to fix that, so it took longer than it should have to fix it. Amazing that it was enough to get Barack Obama reelected so he could kind of get through that with the help of the Elizabeth Warren-sponsored financial reforms and so on. And then we face the pandemic, the equivalent of the Spanish flu. What the New Deal shows us is that even in a situation that is unprecedented in people's lifetimes or even their memories of stories from their parents and grandparents, government can play a role if it takes action, as we've heard, if it keeps trying when it gets turned back, but whether it's by the Supreme Court, and we had that in the 30s, we're going to probably have that again. We almost had that and had some of that for the poorest Americans on Medicaid. When it gets turned back by obstructionists in the Congress, whether they are racist or royalists or economic royalists, keep trying, keep at it, and you can succeed. Not all at once. You won't see it all at once. You'll see it in the gradual progress and some of the end product. That's what we need to do now. That's why what's happening is what has needed to happen. The sausage-making process of legislation leading to a very significant package that isn't the end of what needs to be done.
I think we've got time for at least 10 minutes, and depending on the panelists and the Roosevelt House, could go longer. But let's begin the questions and then see where we are at 5 o'clock.
So here's a question from one of our Zoom attendees. Bradley Bryn asks, Since you are all descendants of such impactful public servants, how can we instill and emphasize the value of public service in young people today, given the culture in which we live, where so much value is placed on fame and social media detracts from the value of public service?
And let's please answer that, but let's also ask our younger people here to answer that as well. But go ahead, Jim. Or
I think it's less an issue of having to teach it to them than not beat it out of them. Nancy, you like that? You know, look, one of my big fears as a homeless advocate was that we'd have a whole generation of kids that would grow up in New York City thinking that this is the norm, right? Homelessness has been a crisis for 4 decades, and I don't think any of us are surprised when we see mass homelessness. It's been around for so long. And so the fear is then that it gets normalized. But, you know, my kids are now 6 and 8, and they are appalled, as are their schoolmates, when they see, you know, the public spectacle of human suffering. It's a natural thing to want to do something about it, and to do something about it now. And, you know, I think as Scott was just talking about, you know, the way we've seen movements rising up now and having such real effect gives me a lot of optimism about what's in the future. You know, they should kick us out and take over. We are, you know, we didn't do it right, but we tried, and it is time to let other people do it. So I think the quick answer to that is to not let people get too cynical, not let our kids get too cynical, and let them know that they should criticize us, open ourselves up to that, and admit that there are better ways of doing things than the ways that we might think are the best ways.
I do have one little thing I'll add to that, which is that my kids are older, from high school to law school, but they use they're all quite politically active, and they use social media to get involved on campaigns or spread the word about causes and things like that. So I don't think, as much as I hate social media, I do think sometimes it can be a force for good, and it can be a way to organize and to get out the vote or raise awareness of issues and things like that.
I was really going to just pick up on something David said earlier, which is that what young people today, and young to me now covers a fairly broad spectrum, have suffered from is the Ronald Reagan point of view that government is the problem. And that devastated, I think, the attitude of young people about public service. We have the opportunity to now, if we dramatically expand public service, to provide role models.
We have a question here, this gentleman.
Can you hear me okay? Thank you all for being with us. This has been an incredible panel. There's been a debate about Build Back Better and whether it should be focused on doing a few things very, very well, or a lot of things to satisfy a lot of different constituencies. And I guess I'm curious as to whether you think the New Deal generation would have a thought and lessons learned from the New Deal in terms of how it should inform what Build Back Better ultimately looks like. Thank you.
Tomlin?
Yeah, I mean, just one basic thing that I've noticed is I'm not exactly sure what's in it. You know, it changes and changes, and there hasn't been any advertising, really. When in the New Deal, we had those wonderful posters and everything. So there was been a lack of that. But what should be in it was your question, right? So I'd say start as much as you can. I wouldn't limit it. That would be my instinct. I would say start as many, you know, in a reasonable way, not with too little, but with a good little start, and hope that future legislation will support it going forward.
I would say the lesson of the New Deal is go big or go home. Start big. Politics is the art of the possible. The perfect is the enemy of the good. We will end up with one of the biggest packages in the history of America. And it won't have everything that we wanted, just as Social Security didn't. But if people get a taste of something great, hopefully there will be political pressure and movements rising up to say, don't take this valuable thing, this child care, this Medicare benefit, don't take it away from me, make it better, and it'll be a process of improvement. But we've got to keep the pressure on, make them do it.
Do you have time for, we have another Zoom question, then in the back we have a question after your Zoom question. And then we'll check to see if we should wrap up, but go ahead.
This question mentions a grandmother, and I think it could be either Eleanor or Frances. Thomas Flanagan asks, how do you think your grandmother persisted through all the sexism against women in politics in order to be successful in her role in government?
We can go. Yeah, we could do both grandmothers. Yeah, well, she was very strategic in how she dressed. Partway early on, and it may have been Sarah, Eleanor Roosevelt, saying maybe you should dress in a very matronly fashion so that you don't, get any ideas, or they don't get any ideas, and so that maybe they'll do as you say. And so she was working with men, but she didn't try to fight that. She just tried to she focused on being effective within that environment. And she didn't try to change it or anything. And she didn't even know about the concept of a glass ceiling or whatever. So, and FDR had put her in a position so high that there was nobody could really discuss it. Although she was, and then just one little tidbit, she was the first Madam Secretary, of course. And that little anecdote happens in the hallway. She's walking along with a senior statesman, and the press comes rushing up and says, "What should we call you?" Because they knew Mr. Secretary, but they didn't know what to call her. And the senior statesman, who I'm not sure who it was, said, "You may call her Madam Secretary."
Stuck.
It stuck.
And you still do it today. And I would just add that I think that my grandmother did two things. First of all, she just ignored a lot of that criticism. So, for example, when the general in the Pacific said, why would he want that woman coming and visiting the troops? She just went and did it. And afterwards, he said it was the most important thing that happened for the morale in the Pacific in all of World War II. But secondly, she did specific acts to counteract sexism, such as that women were not fully allowed to participate in the press corps in Washington, D.C. Even in our lifetimes, we couldn't go to the Gridiron Club dinner and things like that. She would only allow women to cover her press conferences. That was an act of defiance.
I will just add one thing to that, which is that I think it's important to also give credit to the women who did come before them, and there were progressive women and abolitionist women. I mean, there is also a long history of women having an impact on their countries and in the world. And I think both Frances Perkins and Eleanor did follow in the footsteps of Jane Addams and many other progressives who they knew. I mean, Eleanor and Frances Perkins did know Jane Addams, and I think that we have to recognize that they weren't like the only two defying this trend. There was some precedent.
We have one question in the back, and then I think we're at 5 o'clock, so why don't we take this question, answer it, and then, Scott, I don't know if you want to say any concluding words to wrap up the plenary session, but go ahead.
Yes, hi. This is less a question than a brief comment. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the center of his attention was work as a moral imperative for people to exist. He said this over and over again. It wasn't just giving them a paycheck, but it was important to their identity. And that is something that we need to have carry over today under the Biden plan, is how critical that is for both men and women. The second point is Eleanor Roosevelt, and Phoebe began to touch on this, and other comments about her column. Her writings about democracy have not been recognized as an important body of work. She started writing about this in a more serious way during the war, not surprisingly, then during her UN work, and then continuing on. And people should go back and reflect on what she had to say about democracy generally and citizen participation. So I think those two elements really frame the core principles of the New Deal for Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt.
Probably should wrap up, but sure, and I'll turn it over to Jim as the householder here. But let me just say, we are at an inflection point, a very incredibly important point and that's the point of this conference. Is government going to be returned to the New Deal paradigm? Biden has talked about a paradigm shift. FDR talked about a shift from laissez-faire Hooverism to a government that is actively, you know, FDR started out as a deficit hawk. He said there's nothing more important than a balanced budget. And then he came in and said, well, we've got huge crises, we've got to spend, we've got to invest. These are investments that we're talking about in people, and it will grow the economy. Are we going to have a return to that paradigm of a government that is actively, beneficially on the side of the American people and people who want to be American people? That's why we're doing this. That's why we started the dialogue with President Biden back as candidate Biden to try to point out the historic turning point that we are at and to nudge him along and be the wind beneath his wings, or whatever metaphor you want to use. So.
Yeah, so thank you again to you, Scott, and you, David, and Stephen, and everyone behind putting all this together. It is so appropriate that we're doing it here in this house where FDR started his conversations with Francis Perkins. And I really think that what we're about as a group, and what I think this conference is about, is just what FDR asked for. I agree with you, now go and make me do it. That's what we're trying to say to Joe Biden. We are pushing you to do it. We're not disagreeing with you, of course, but we are saying don't be held back by those obstructionists. Don't be held back by all those particular interests out there, whether it's interests in property or coal or simply anti-government or even political partisanship. It needs to be done. That's what we're talking about here. Go to it.